The language of the inscription is Sumerian. Sumerian is the oldest written language. It's not related to any of the Indo-European or Semitic languages in that part of the world.
Before I die, please listen. These haunting words from Assyriologist Samuel Noah Kramer shook the world of ancient history. What truth about the Sumerians was too unsettling to reveal while he lived? Were they simply the first civilized society, or the first to engineer belief itself, merging writing, ritual, and architecture into one seamless system of control? You'll hear what Kramer truly meant by his cryptic confession, and how it changes everything about civilization. Drawing from his unpublished notes, we'll uncover the 5 stages of his hidden revelation. The sentence that wouldn't let go. For decades, Samuel Noah Kramer had read thousands of Sumerian tablets, lists of grain deliveries, temple hymns, royal decrees, and creation myths. Each line seemed to belong neatly to its category, until he began noticing something that refused to fit. Certain phrases kept appearing where they had no reason to be. A ceremonial line meant for temple ritual would reappear in a warehouse record. A phrase from a hymn to a god would turn up in a worker's ration list. They were fragments that refused to stay silent, echoes that followed him from one translation to the next. At first, Kramer dismissed them as coincidences or habits of scribes, but as the repetitions grew, so did his unease. These weren't random slips of the stylus. The same patterns, numbers, symbols, and formulaic sentences appeared across entirely different genres of text. He started calling them the sentences that wouldn't let go. They crossed the boundaries between sacred and practical writing, between myth and mathematics. To most scholars, this overlap meant nothing. It was simply the product of shared vocabulary. To Kramer, it was a clue to something deeper, a design hidden inside the world's first writing system. He began tracing these phrases across archives from different cities, Ur, Uruk, Nippur, and found the same patterns repeating. One phrase in particular haunted him: to raise the pure mountain and bind heaven and earth. It appeared in temple hymns describing offerings to the gods, but the exact same line was also found in construction logs for the ziggurat of Ur. Why would a builder's record repeat the language of a sacred chant? Why would the act of laying bricks be described in cosmic terms? The more Kramer looked, the more connections emerged. Lines that opened prayers also opened accounting tablets. Blessing formulas matched the phrases used to seal trade agreements. Numbers considered divine, 3, 7, 60, appeared not only in myths, but in supply tallies and ration schedules. He realized that the Sumerians were not merely using writing to record their world. They were using it to align their world. The same words that invoked the gods also defined labor, trade, and governance. This discovery unsettled him because it meant that writing in Sumer was not neutral. It wasn't just a tool for memory, it was a structure for thought. By embedding sacred language in the ordinary, the Sumerians blurred the line between worship and administration. Every tablet, whether it listed sacrifices or taxes, reinforced the same worldview, that divine order and human order were one and the same. Kramer began to wonder if the Sumerians had designed this overlap intentionally. Perhaps their scribes, trained within temple schools, learned to weave mythic language into bureaucratic records on purpose. If so, every document they produced was more than data. It was devotion disguised as routine. He suspected this was no accident of culture, but a conscious system, a civilization teaching itself how to think through repetition and rhythm. By the time Kramer wrote his later works, he could no longer ignore the evidence. These sentences, the ones that refused to let go, formed the backbone of an entire ideology encoded in clay. They made the act of administration itself a sacred duty, transforming writing into both a practical tool and a spiritual exercise. To read a Sumerian tablet was to glimpse how language could hold a civilization together. Little did Kramer know, those stray phrases would soon point him beyond words, to a message written not on tablets, but into the stones of the ziggurat itself. The ziggurat as a 3-dimensional text. When Samuel Noah Kramer turned his attention from the tablets to the towering ruins of the ziggurat at Ur, he began to suspect that the Sumerians had not merely written their worldview, they had built it. Rising from the flat Mesopotamian plain like a man-made mountain, the great ziggurat of Ur stood as both temple and symbol. Its massive terraces climbed toward the heavens, culminating in a shrine dedicated to the moon god Nana. Every brick, every step, and every alignment with the stars seemed to carry the same message Kramer had been uncovering in clay: the fusion of heaven, earth, and authority. What fascinated Kramer was how the written and the built mirrored each other. In the temple archives at Ur, he found endless lists of materials, baskets of clay, measurements of bricks, and offerings of grain. At first glance, these were ordinary administrative records, but their phrasing was uncanny. Lines from hymns appeared in construction logs. The same ritual verbs, to purify, to ascend, to bind heaven, were used to describe both religious ceremonies and the hauling of building materials. To Kramer, this could not be a coincidence. The language used to build the temple was itself sacred. Every act of construction was written as a continuation of creation. He began calling the ziggurat a three-dimensional text, a monument that could be read as well as climbed. Each terrace, he noted, represented a level of the cosmos described in Sumerian myths. The lowest terrace symbolized the earthly plane, the middle levels the atmosphere and stars, and the highest the divine realm. Worshippers ascending the stairways were not merely walking upward, they were moving through layers of theology. Kramer realized that the ziggurat was not only an architectural wonder, it was the physical expression of the same patterns he found hidden in the tablets. The priests, scribes, and laborers who built it were, knowingly or not, enacting the words inscribed in clay. The deeper Kramer studied, the clearer the parallels became. In one set of tablets, offerings to Nana were listed in rhythmic, formulaic lines, each mirroring the measured structure of the ziggurat's terraces. In another, the king's role was described as the stair between gods and men, the living embodiment of the ziggurat itself. These phrases weren't poetic flourishes, they were blueprints. The building was both a symbol and a script, where architecture, religion, and politics spoke the same language. Kramer's growing conviction was that the Sumerians had achieved something extraordinary. They had turned their architecture into an extension of their writing system. The ziggurat and the tablets did not simply coexist, they completed each other. One made belief visible, the other made it repeatable. Together, they created a cycle in which every festival, offering, and law reaffirmed the cosmic hierarchy etched into the city's skyline. This realization transformed Kramer's understanding of Sumerian civilization. He began to see the ziggurat not as a building that hosted religion, but as religion itself, a living, breathing doctrine of stone. The structure's geometry and its surrounding archives formed a single message: that the order of the world was fixed, layered, and divine. Every ascent up its stairways mirrored the human desire to rise toward understanding, but it also reminded every citizen of their place within that order. For Kramer, this was the key to his growing theory. The Sumerians didn't separate sacred and secular life because they couldn't. The very language they wrote and the buildings they erected made sure of it. Their civilization was a text you could walk through, a theology you could touch. But Kramer's deeper revelation came when he looked at the scribes themselves, the gatekeepers of this living system. The scribes who ruled through words. As Samuel Noah Kramer followed the trail of repeating phrases from temple walls to ziggurat terraces, one truth became impossible to ignore. Behind every sacred hymn, every royal decree, and every ledger of bricks stood the scribes. They were the hidden architects of Sumerian civilization, the ones who transformed thought into record and record into law. While kings built monuments and priests led rituals, the scribes were the quiet engineers of continuity. Without them, there would be no civilization to remember. In the great tablet houses of cities like Ur and Nippur, young scribes trained for years under strict supervision. They copied lexical lists, hymns, contracts, and myths until they could carve cuneiform signs from memory. Kramer noted that these schools were unlike any others in the ancient world. They didn't separate the sacred from the administrative. A student could spend 1 hour practicing the dimensions of a brick shipment and the next reciting a hymn to Inanna. Over time, these parallel disciplines blurred, producing a mindset where writing itself was a ritual act. Each stylus stroke was both documentation and devotion. Cuneiform, with its thousands of wedge-shaped signs, was not an easy script to master. Many symbols carried multiple meanings, depending on context and pronunciation. A sign for star could also mean God, and the symbol for life could double as a count. Kramer realized that this flexibility gave scribes enormous interpretive power. They could encode theology inside economics, embed myth into trade records, or lace divine order through administrative texts, all without changing a single mark. In other words, they didn't just record power, they wrote it into existence. The scribes' control of language made them indispensable to both temple and throne. Every law, hymn, and transaction passed through their hands. To the public, they were servants of the gods and the king. In practice, they were the system's nervous system, deciding which words endured. Kramer was struck by how their training bound them to secrecy and hierarchy. Knowledge of writing was limited, guarded, and inherited through a few elite families. Literacy was power, and power was piety. A scribe's quill was as sacred as a priest's staff. In his research, Kramer compared scribal formulae across centuries and found a continuity that defied dynastic change. Even when kings fell and cities burned, the phrases persisted, the same openings, closings, and ritual numbers. To him, this endurance revealed that it wasn't the rulers who shaped the civilization's identity, but the scribes who maintained the code. They were the custodians of cosmic order, ensuring that each new reign spoke the same divine language. Theirs was a quiet dominion, enforced not by armies, but by words impressed into clay. This discovery reframed Kramer's understanding of the Sumerians entirely. The ziggurat might have embodied their theology, but the scribes were its interpreters, those who could translate between gods and men, myth and math. Every inscription, from creation myths to ration lists, bore its invisible fingerprints. They decided which ideas were preserved, which phrases were repeated, and which truths were canonized. To Kramer, that made them the first true authors of ideology in human history. Still, one mystery remained. Why did so many myths and ledgers repeat the same numbers, symbols, and phrases? The pattern, hidden in the clay. By the final decade of his life, Samuel Noah Kramer had read more Sumerian tablets than any living scholar. But instead of satisfaction, he felt a gnawing sense of incompletion, an intuition that the real message was still buried beneath the obvious. The words were clear, the grammar stable. Yet something about the repetition of forms, numbers, and phrases seemed too deliberate to dismiss as convention. There was a pattern in the clay, one that stretched across centuries, city-states, and kings. It linked myths to ledgers, prayers to tax rolls, and cosmic hierarchies to human ones. In his notes, Kramer began charting these recurring sequences like a mathematician mapping constellations. He noticed that certain words appeared together in predictable cycles: pure, measure, binding, ascending. The same triads surfaced in temple hymns, festival decrees, and even scribal exercises. At first, it looked like standard ritual language, formulaic, symbolic, perhaps even poetic. But as he traced the combinations further, he realized they formed a structural rhythm, a template that governed how the Sumerians organized not only language, but reality itself. The numbers were even more revealing. Across hundreds of tablets, the same sacred counts, 3, 7, 12, 60, anchored everything from mythic genealogies to labor records. Kramer began to see them not as a coincidence, but as calibration. To the Sumerians, numbers weren't tools of calculation, they were laws of harmony, shaping the rhythm of daily life to mirror cosmic order. When a priest offered 7 sheep, or a builder recorded 60 bricks, it wasn't just bookkeeping, it was ritual math, an act of aligning the city with the universe. What struck Kramer most was how the same pattern survived shifts in power and geography. Whether the ruler was Ur-Nammu or Shulgi, whether the city was Uruk or Lagash, the phrasing and structure persisted. It was as if every scribe, consciously or not, was copying from the same invisible template. The civilization's bureaucracy, its religion, and its mythology were synchronized through the same textual DNA. This discovery led Kramer to a radical idea, that the Sumerians used writing not only to record their world, but to sustain it. The act of inscribing order into clay was what made that order real. He began calling it the Sumerian Code, not a cipher to be cracked, but a cultural algorithm that replicated itself through every layer of society. The ziggurat was its monument, the tablet its instrument, and the scribe its operator. Each reinforced the other in a perfect loop. To read or recite a text was to participate in maintaining the system. To write one was to renew it. The tablets were not just archives, they were engines of continuity. Kramer confided to a colleague that this realization disturbed him more than any myth or artifact he had ever studied. It meant that civilization's first writing system might have also been its first programming language, a technology for encoding hierarchy, belief, and obedience into the very syntax of society. If so, the Sumerians hadn't simply invented literacy, they had invented ideological engineering. The pattern in the clay wasn't a message about gods, it was a message about control. As his health declined, Kramer finally confessed what he believed the tablets were really saying. "Before I die, please listen." In the final years of his life, Samuel Noah Kramer spoke less in lectures and more in fragments, half-thoughts that lingered between revelation and warning. His students remembered him as methodical and modest, never prone to dramatics. So when he began ending letters and interviews with the phrase, "Before I die, please listen," it caught attention. It was not the plea of a man chasing fame, but of one burdened by something left unsaid. After decades of decoding the words of the world's first civilization, he believed he had found the truth they had been writing all along, a truth about how writing itself could shape the human mind. Kramer's discovery was not a single tablet or translation, but a realization that had grown slowly over time. The Sumerians, he concluded, were the first to understand that language could build worlds, not metaphorically, but literally. Their words weren't just descriptive, they were performative. When a scribe wrote that a king was chosen by the gods, that very act of inscription made it true within the Sumerian worldview. Writing was an act of creation, and those who controlled it shaped reality itself. In his late notebooks, Kramer wrote that every civilization inherits two kinds of power: the visible, bricks, armies, temples, and the invisible, stories, laws, and myths. The Sumerians had fused these powers through writing. The ziggurat embodied divine hierarchy in stone, while cuneiform preserved it in text. Together they formed a feedback loop that taught generations to accept order as natural. The priest read the tablet, the worker hauled the brick, and both believed they were fulfilling the will of the gods. In truth, they were enacting the logic encoded by their scribes centuries before. Kramer feared this insight would be misunderstood as mystical or conspiratorial, so he rarely spoke it plainly. Yet in one letter to a colleague, he wrote, "The Sumerians discovered that to rule the mind, one needs only rule the symbols." He underlined it twice. To him, this was their most profound invention, the realization that control over language could replace control over force. It was the quiet foundation upon which all organized societies would later stand. The tragedy, Kramer believed, was that this power was invisible precisely because it worked so well. Once writing was embedded in ritual and governance, no one questioned it. The words of the gods became the grammar of the state. The Sumerians had created not just a script, but a system, a way of thinking that would ripple through law codes, religions, and bureaucracies for millennia. When modern people look at those tablets, they see ancient texts. Kramer saw the blueprint of civilization itself. His final writings, found among his unpublished papers, read more like reflections than scholarship. He warned that the separation between sacred and secular, between myth and record, was an illusion born long after Sumer. The first writers, he noted, did not record truth, they manufactured it. To him, this wasn't condemnation, but recognition. Humanity's first great technology had always been belief, belief made durable through words. He marveled at how stories could shape reality, guiding societies as surely as laws or armies. In his view, myths were not errors but tools, frameworks that allowed humans to organize, remember, and imagine. And in that light, every tablet, scroll, or inscription became less a record of what was and more a blueprint for what could be. In the end, Samuel Noah Kramer's warning echoes louder than ever. The Sumerians taught humanity that whoever writes history also defines truth. Their clay tablets didn't just record a civilization, they created one. Through writing, they built the first system where words shaped faith, power, and order. So ask yourself, do our institutions still use words the same way? If this opened your eyes, like and subscribe, and watch our next deep dive into the ancient secrets that still shape the modern world.